Hey, Larry, welcome back to our podcast. It's good to see you today.
Good to see you again, Russ. How's everything going?
Well, to be honest with you, I'm kind of nervous and slightly scared.
Okay.
Well,
Do I want to?
I saw an ad
Ah,
somewhere, and it said, "Are you responsible for cybersecurity?" And I think it was supposed to be an ad for you
for
and people
me.
like you who are actual cybersecurity experts.
Okay.
But I interpreted it as aimed at the general public. And specifically, if I'm responsible for cybersecurity, I don't feel equipped because I barely even know what that means.
That's fair. That's a challenge for sure to begin to think differently about how you approach cyber uh, as an individual, as well as maybe your responsibility as an employee or your responsibility as you get further up the chain in management. Essentially, it's a little bit like safety in that it's something we should all be aware of, but we don't necessarily always think about our personal responsibility where something like cyber is concerned.
All right, so let's talk about safety because I have a specific example came up. I'm writing a project plan related to a robot that's in a non-industrial environment. It's closer to a lab environment.
Okay, so
It's a
is it a real robot or is it a cobot?
Cobots are real robots too, Larry.
Well, so I separate the two from will the thing kill me if it does something wrong, or is it probably just going to maybe injure me at slightly at best?
Well, I'm the project manager, so I don't know.
Okay,
It's
that's fair.
it's a it is a six axis.
Oh, it's a robot.
I'm not sure what it has in terms of force feedback and sensing. So my understanding from the rest of the team is that if the robot swings into me, it won't kill me. Um, I also think that it's speed limited or sorry, do they call it velocity or speed in this case?
Take your pick. Same thing.
Okay, I think it goes slow so that even if it hits me, it won't kill me. I'm not sure that it's fancy enough to detect that it ran into somebody and stops.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of like a robot, a typical scare robot, for example, being in teach mode, right? So it's limited. I think it's 2 inches a second or something like that is the maximum velocity that it can move at. With the thought process being that if it actually impacted you, you could get out of its way before it would do something to crush you or anything like that.
And the Scara robot is basically a horizontal arm on a more or less a pivot point. Is that the
Yeah.
Scara
Yep.
layout?
On a pedestal essentially, typically, but yeah.
And this guy that we're talking about is an arm, which I think is I want to say it's just classified as an arm, and it has
Probably.
six axes of motion, and then at the end it has a wrist that can pivot and that kind of stuff, and you stick an end effector on it.
Yep.
So I'm writing requirements for what the robot has to do. And I'm in my zone. I'm like, well, here's how the controller on the robot needs to interface with the other controllers in the system. I'm drawing box diagrams. I'm really feeling great. I got accountabilities laid out. So who's responsible for what? I've got who's going to sign off. I've got acceptance criteria. I'm feeling so happy with my ability to PM right now in this project. And then and then
This commercial.
I don't know. I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm like, there's no safety plan for this robot. And we're trying to run this thing unattended. We can't run it unattended. Like we have no idea who's going to walk by. We have no idea who would potentially disrupt it. So in my project management role, I'm like, okay, so our plan is going to be we design this process to run automatically without human intervention, but it can't run unattended. It has to have a person sitting there supervising when we run it.
Okay. So it's
This
not.
was the point. The point of this was that I feel like I'm responsible for safety because I woke up in the middle of the night being concerned about what we were going to do about this robot.
Well, and I think the culture as a whole, right, and especially in industry, has changed over the last 20 years where every individual feels responsible for safety. But that same pivot hasn't happened essentially in the cybersecurity space.
Oh man, how did it happen in industrial?
So my opinion, I think the way it happened in industrial actually falls back on something that happened in India with Union Carbide, essentially, where several thousand, maybe even a couple of 100,000 people were impacted as a result of a chemical agent release, essentially in Bhopal, India. And that really caused a pivot in the chemical industry to think differently about safety. And what we know of is process safety management and LOPA analysis and all the other things associated with that were birthed out of that. And then that was really pushed down into the culture of a company. And people realize that if I don't actually change the culture, I'm not going to change the way I think differently about safety. And so you started getting like the safety minutes at the beginning of a meeting, or a safety plan being part of every project management plan, or different things of that nature. And so that became part of our culture, making sure that everybody goes home safely with all 10 fingers and all 10 toes, right? Um, we haven't made that same shift or pivot in the cyberspace. And there's been people that talk about, a cyber Pearl Harbor, or a cyber Bhopal, India, or different things like that as being, unfortunately, what may be necessary to change our mindset. I'm hoping that isn't really true, but the reality is that we can change our mindset before we get there and think differently about cybersecurity.
Well, I mean, what happened when there's a big incident? You got headlines, you got suffering.
Yeah, I
How,
think
like what?
I would love to tell you the big headlines and the whatever, essentially, and the suffering are what makes the difference, but I don't really think it does, right? I mean, if that were the case, then there were certainly other safety incidents that would have happened before the incident with Union Carbide that would have resulted in change. Unfortunately, what really impacted industry in that situation was the cost associated with the incident. That cost, both in terms of human life and financial dollars, was so big that the industry had to change.
Brutal. Well, I mean, like Deepwater Horizon. Are there? I don't know oil and gas well enough, but I don't get the impression that there's been an enormous change after that.
I think if you, I don't know oil and gas probably well enough either to be fair as an SME, but from things that I've heard talking to colleagues, there were definitely additions to PSM's solutions, process safety management solutions, and process design that happened as a result of that incident. So I think that incident did make its way into the way the oil and gas industry thought about underwater drilling. Whereas, and really that's the appropriate place when you have a mature process for dealing with something like that. It doesn't make sense for a chemical company that doesn't do any underwater drilling to necessarily think differently about what they do, right?
Man, risk management is hard when it stacks up from a person. And like, did I put my steel toes on? And I worked for a landscaping company for a long time, and I don't mean like I wasn't managing the landscaping company. I was digging holes, and a bunch of the people that worked there, no ear protection with a backpack blower, and I'm like, every time you turn that thing on, your ears are being damaged, and that's
Right.
for life. You need to wear ear protection. But
Yep.
this was not a particularly OSHA compliant organization that I was working for, and everybody was like a subcontractor, and fast and loose, right? And it was like, this is how the costs stay down. And I, I feel like when the enemy or the threat is not visible, like identity theft, or uh, bank account details, or pure financial crimes, or like your passwords have been, how many times has there been a data breach and it's like, oh, you've been breached, okay, well, what does this mean for me? I have to change, like, I need to get a new credit card. It's not tangible, even in the way that future deafness is tangible, even though it's not tangible in that moment. So, I like, what do we do? Like, what do we do to make it more tangible?
Well, that's a good question. Um, I think again, it's a little bit like the safety side of things. You need to bring it up on a regular basis. So take it back to that situation that you were in with somebody with a blower, essentially, that didn't have ear protection in. Did you, because you did think about it, say something, even if it was ignored or avoided, essentially, to say, hey, you may want to actually put ear protection in.
Yeah, but it was full of swagger. I was like, "You're really gonna do that without ear protection?"
Yeah, and see
And like,
that.
no, and they were like, "No, I'm tough. It's fine." And I'm like, "Yeah, but like, it's damaging your ears." They're like, "I'm fine," and I'm like, "You're definitely not fine. That's not how this works. It's not fine."
Right.
And then it was the end of it.
Yeah,
That was the end.
and that's where, like, kind of the whole cybersecurity, do you accept the risk thing, right? So I've had multiple conversations with people. Back to your example of, hey, I've this account's been compromised. Well, they think they changed the password on that account, they're good. without thinking about the fact that that's the same password they use on 10 other accounts, and they probably need to go change those other 10 accounts to be unique passwords, right? Which is best practice. And I may say something to somebody about, hey, you probably need to approach that differently than you have in the past. And they look at me kind of like, your guy, I'll be fine. It'll be fine. I'll just change that one password. It'll be okay. And I'll usually end that conversation with something like, okay, so you're accepting the risk on these other 9 accounts. Then an adversary isn't going to piece together this password they got from maybe your Facebook account, and now they're logging into your bank.
All right. So I wasn't going to call anybody in my close circle of acquaintances, colleagues, family, and friends out here. And this applies to more than one person I've had this conversation with. Similar situation, reused password. I use a password manager with other people that are in my family, and I'll get like a hey, this is a reused password on somebody else's password. And I'll say, hey, this needs to change. And I say, I think it'll be okay. And I'm like, okay. If I drove without a seatbelt, you'd lose your mind about me driving without a seatbelt. This is me telling you that you're willing to accept the risk of identity theft, but you're really, really nervous about, the risk of me driving without a seatbelt. There's another guy I used to be friends with, uh, kept a personal defense shotgun in the bedroom, accessible. He had kids, but they were older kids. Also, drove without a seatbelt routinely and rode a motorcycle with no PPE except a helmet. And I'm like, it's none of my freaking business. It is not my business what risks you're willing to take. But analytically, when I think about the risk of a home invader that needs a home defense weapon versus the risk of that being used for another purpose versus the other risks that you take, I'm not sure the calculus for all those different risks are being compared against each other in any kind of like conscious way.
No, I think that's fair, right? I mean, that's why I make the comment I do with people about reusing passwords. It's one thing to reuse a password across your social media accounts, right?
Yeah.
Instagram, Facebook, whatever, versus that same password then being found in your 401k or in your checkbook. It's a completely different level of risk when you're doing it at that level. I encourage people to use password managers, but the funny part to me is a lot of times people push back and go, "Well, they're too confusing," or "Well, then I got to pay what $30 a year or whatever for a subscription." I'm like, that just seems like cheap insurance to me. But you know, I have a different perspective on it, and I think the risk is a whole lot higher than people give it credit for being. Right? I mean, the adversary has gotten really good at pairing together an email address and a password, and doing a little bit of social engineering and figuring out maybe because of something where you live or the fact
Hmm.
that you're prior military or whatever. So you might go look for, okay, well, who's the credit union in that area that's associated with some DoD background, right? So you go to Huntsville and you think Redstone Federal Credit Union. Well, if you're retired military and I find your email address somewhere, I got a pretty good shot of being able to log into Redstone with your account information, especially if you reuse your password, right? Now, banks are getting better at forcing us to be better, right? Because they're forcing MFA. So now, whoever's credential I stole gets a text notification saying, hey, somebody's trying to log into your account. What are you going to do about it then? Are you going to change
Okay,
your
so
password
I'm
now?
still concerned because I wouldn't say you're preaching to the choir. I'm not. I have no expertise in this area, but I do know that MFA is multi-factor authentication. I use a password manager. I know the names of two password management tools, and I know which one has most recently been subjected to a breach. Uh, I feel like I am slightly above average compared to, I don't know, most of the people I talk to about this stuff. And this concerns me a great deal. So I guess my direct question is, where's the line between basic hygiene, don't reuse a password, and specific subject matter expertise in this stuff? Where's the boundary?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Can you
Well,
maybe?
is this, if I, there's your sort of like everyday skills that you use to be safe, and then there's, I'm an expert in so and so thing. So think about from like a regular IT perspective. It used to be when I was growing up, it was jokes about who could program the VCR. Well, now it's like jokes about who can use
Set up
Facebook
your
or
or
set up
set
the
up your
phone, yeah,
access
cell
wireless
phone.
access point or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, so like 15 years ago, maybe I was an expert if I could set up network attached storage. But today, I did that by spending money and reading 3 web pages, and that was it. So what used to be specialized expertise is now basic consumer skill. You know what I mean? And where's the line for cyber hygiene, which I would call don't reuse passwords, use a long password, use complicated passwords, don't use, follow the best practices, right? Like versus somebody who is qualified to get hired to professionally help other people, follow those best practices, whether it's in an IT department or OT, or go work for a, I don't know, password management company or something.
Yeah, I think it's those that can go a step further, right? And so they're no longer looking at how are you managing your passwords, but they're as a company initiative looking at things like maybe a data loss prevention initiative where they're looking using tools essentially to digest information going in and out with emails and trying to find things that you shouldn't be doing, like putting things that look like social security numbers, for example, or other PII in an email. You could spend a lot of time talking about other things from a firewall perspective or implementing credential management or different things of that nature. Those are all key. And when you're thinking about those on a broader perspective, that's probably an SME versus somebody that's just doing the right thing from a hygiene perspective.
That makes sense. I mean, how do you feel about when we were talking about password managers and reused passwords? I immediately thought about automation and process, but not in the process industry that we're thinking of. When I have a reused password, as long as I'm using a password manager, the password manager tells me it's a reused password. So I no longer have to think about reused passwords. I don't have to go down a list and compare passwords. Are those types of automation, if you can call it automation, is that stuff, should I be right to be hopeful about those kind of things?
Well, I think you're definitely fair to be hopeful about those kinds of things. I mean, most of those password managers go beyond just telling you you've duplicated a password, but they're doing dark web searches for hashes that match the hashes that are in your password database. So they're even telling you, hey, this is a known compromised password, even if it wasn't your password or your email address or other credential that it's associated with. It's at least letting you know that, hey, that password's in rainbow tables, right? It's in the wild. It's in
Hold on, we have to
somebody's.
hold on. This is important. We have to repeat this with like language that my grandmother would understand,
Yeah,
because it's
so
very important.
yeah, it is. That's fair. So the password managers, in addition to telling you that a password is duplicated inside your database, it also is letting you know that that password has been used by others, maybe you, and found in a breach, and that adversaries now have that password as well. Now,
Yeah, so that
whether they know that password is associated with you individually may be a different question, but just the fact that it's out there means that it's now a part of the tools that tradecraft uses essentially to break into things. And so at that point, if you're using that password, it's known compromised, you should change it and use something different.
and in story form, this means if Granny has used the password Fluffy for her email and her bank, it's bad that she's used Fluffy, named after her dog, by the way, for the dog and the bank. That's bad that it's reused. But the password management software where she can put that password to help her use a better password and make it so she doesn't have to remember lots of passwords, that software is looking on the internet for places where passwords show up in lists of common passwords. And if Fluffy is a very, very common password, or if Fluffy was stolen from your bank as a password, there are people who just put lists of that stuff on the internet for other bad people to get passwords that are widely used. So just because you were good with your password doesn't mean that your password is in the clear. And comparing to, this is a publicly posted password on a place that anybody can find it on the internet if they look hard enough, and saying don't use that because we know it's over here and somewhere on the internet.
Yep.
It's so easy to understand this stuff after the fact when it's sort of laid out one step at a time. It's just every time there's always another vector, there's always another risk factor, and the piecing it together has to be beforehand, not after the fact. When you have, oh, here was how the breach worked. They flew a drone up to a window that had a camera and looked at the password when somebody typed it in. Okay, well, that makes perfect sense once you've told me. But no, that wasn't on my mind as a thing that was likely to happen or something like that.
Right. No, absolutely. That's part of the challenge, unfortunately. And then how much, maybe back to your original question, Are you responsible for your cybersecurity? Or I can't remember the exact wording at the moment. Are you
That
responsible
was
for
that was it. Am
cybersecurity?
I responsible for cybersecurity?
Yeah. So, you can take it back to that. It's like, okay, what are you doing to stay up on what adversaries are doing so that you're not putting yourself at risk, if anything? And maybe you're doing nothing. Hopefully, if you're employed somewhere, they're doing some awareness training essentially to tell you, hey, not just don't reuse passwords, but maybe don't accept every hotspot that shows up in your environment and the other types of attacks essentially that are commonplace today, so that you're at least doing what you can to make it more difficult on an adversary to compromise your employer and or yourself personally.
Well, I have to ask you this: are you responsible for cybersecurity?
I wish I wasn't. There are days. There are days when I'd like to go back to just kind of being less aware, essentially, of what adversaries are doing. Right. I mean, yeah. But see, here's the difference. I'm not just responsible for my personal cybersecurity and or my family's cybersecurity, but I am at least partially responsible for my employer's cybersecurity. And I don't mean that as just a traditional employee. I mean, I have responsibility for the IT security controls that we deploy and how we deploy them, and protecting the information that our business has access to.
I'm going to ask a question that you don't have to answer if you don't want to.
Yeah, I may not
If
be able to answer it, but go ahead.
if something bad happens in cybersecurity to the company, but you've done all the right stuff, but something's still bad. There was still an attack or a breach or something like that, but you've done all the right stuff. Is your job directly at risk? And if so, does firing you actually change anything?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So I think in my case, no, because I work for a pretty small business that realizes the difference. But if I was the CISO of a large Fortune 100, Fortune 500 company, then unfortunately, probably your job is at risk if you have a compromise like that, because um, people are, shareholders, things of that nature, are looking for, hey, who can I stick this on? And so if you're the acting CISO of company XYZ, that's a Fortune 100, 500 food and beverage company, your job probably is at risk, even if you did all the right things. I mean, that's unfortunate, but unfortunately, it's an accurate statement.
Well, it's unfortunate that they're going to have some time to go enjoy cocktails on their boat.
Yeah, that's fair.
They're not like you and me, Larry.
No, that's a whole little different level of lifestyle and everything else. That's a fair point. But you mentioned, am I responsible for cybersecurity and what you're doing, even as you're a project manager in this robotics application you're talking about? Well, you're doing what you're doing because of due diligence at the end of the day, right? I mean, whether or not you're an engineer and that's a part of your thought process. Increasingly today, cybersecurity is becoming something that people should or may eventually be considered part of the due diligence of doing anything like system integration, for example.
Right.
And so you may find a day when not doing the right thing from a cybersecurity perspective could result in your employer being sued, may not result in your individual termination, but it certainly could have a financial impact on who you work for and potentially your ability to continue to work for that company if it was egregious enough.
Well, what concerns me is that I feel like I'm doing a comparatively okay job versus other alternatives for who would be doing the work, but doing a pretty bad job compared to, um, you know, a nominal imaginary ideal.
Yeah, and I think that's where it'd be interesting to know a little deeper about what you are and aren't doing. And I'm curious only because the reason I guess that I say that is I found a lot of times people that think they aren't doing as much as they could be are doing probably a lot more than the average company or the average individual.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Well, that's what concerns me.
well, that's fair too. But at least you're doing your part not to become the easy target, right? I mean, part of what a lot of companies really ought to be after is not being the low hanging fruit for an adversary, right?
Oh
If I'm,
yeah.
I don't want to be the guy that's easy to compromise. I want to be the one that somebody's got to work for it. If for no other reason, then maybe they'll leave me alone and go look for an easier target.
Do you know the phrase about the bear?
Yeah, I don't have to be able to outrun the bear. I just need to be able to outrun you
Yeah.
if I'm being chased.
Yeah.
Yes, same principle applies, right? I mean, that's exactly what I'm talking about. If I don't have to necessarily be the most secure person out there, but I need to be more secure than the average person for sure, but more secure maybe than somebody else that does what I do. Because the other reality, and this kind of gets back into supply chain risk management, is if I want to compromise a Fortune 100 or 500 company, it's probably a lot easier to compromise one of their suppliers than it is to compromise them.
Do you ever wish you could go back to being young and lacking knowledge and foolish and just charge ahead with no concerns and perfect confidence in your ability to do all things?
Every day. Every day.
Yeah, they think it's the wear and tear on the body and the gray hairs. No, it's not that. It's the existential crisis that never stops.
Right. I mean, you realize pretty quickly that you're never going to really win this thing, right? So it's like, okay, do the best you can, and try not to worry about the things that you didn't do when you wake up in the middle of the night and realize that you didn't think about the safety of the design, right?
Just wake up and put it in the project plan. Next problem.
Yep.
All right, Larry, you've made me feel. You've made me feel. Let's just leave it at that.
You're not going to say better or worse, huh?
I had a lot of feel in this conversation. I
There you
appreciate
go.
it.
You're welcome.
Talk to you next.
Hopefully
No, it was
helpful.
great. It was great. It was helpful. It was helpful.
Good.
I'm gonna have to go process and revisit my project plan and have a couple hard conversations with the people in my family about their passwords.
There you go. Well, good luck.
Thanks a ton, Larry. See you next time.
Yep.